QSO Today, Episode 271, Richard Factor, WA2IKL. This episode of QSO Today is sponsored by ICOM America, makers of the finest HF, VHF, and UHF transceivers and accessories for the radio amateur, reminding you that they have just the right rig for contesters, DXers, and rag chewers. And by QRP Labs, my friend Hans Summers, G0UPL's radio kit company, makers of the popular QCX kit transceiver. My thanks to both ICOM America and QRP Labs for sponsoring the QSO Today podcast. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth, 4Z1UG, your host. Richard Factor, WA2IKL, joined the amateur radio ranks 60 years ago and was inspired by the technology dreams of the popular science fiction writers of that era. His interest in radio, electronics, and science led WA2IKL to establish his own technology business, now 50 years old. We discuss the use of his Toyota Prius power system as a backup power supply for his home in this QSO Today. WA2IKL, this is Eric, 4Z1UG. Are you there, Richard?
Well, hello, Eric, 4Z1UG. Yes, I am. This is Richard, WA2IKL.
Richard, thanks for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. I understand you're joining me from New York City, but your home is Sedona, Arizona. Is that right?
That is absolutely correct. We now live in Sedona after most of a lifetime on the East Coast.
And how do you like it there?
It's gorgeous, absolutely beautiful, and we get sunshine pretty much every day.
And did your nose bleed for the first year?
No, it's only at 4,500 feet. I've been higher than that on occasion.
I see, but not drier. It's much drier than New York, I would think.
It is, and that accounts for getting the sunshine almost all the time.
There you go.
Beautiful, and you can walk in your T-shirt in the middle of the winter.
Amazing. Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did it start for you?
Well, even before I got interested in ham radio, I was interested in electronics, or at least electrical stuff. I had electric trains when I was a kid, but I liked to experiment. I would take the lead out of lead pencils, which of course is graphite, connected to the train transformer, and make a nice carbon arc. But eventually I got in enough trouble with my parents that they said, look, you've got to stop doing that. You've got to stop playing around with chemicals. And they sent me off to summer camp. And at summer camp, they had a ham radio station, W1MYM, I'm sure now defunct or extinct. And I learned about ham radio. And I said, boy, this is great, and it won't ruin my eyesight.
Was there an Elmer or was there a mentor at W1MYM at summer camp that kind of created this interest in you?
Yes, another big yes on that. A couple of the counselors, who of course were young people, but I didn't recognize it. They seemed like grown-ups at the time. K1DEK Bert and John Duda, call unremembered, but I'm sure changed since then, were counselors and in charge of the radio station, and I very enthusiastically pestered them when I should have been committing premeditated acts of sport.
So how did it go from there? Well, you came home from summer camp. What did you ask your parents for? The license manual or?
No, I got my license, I think, at summer camp. I said, oh, my God, this is fabulous. I can take the test. Of course, in those days, you had to wait for the FCC to process everything for months. So I ended up getting my call letters, I think, in the late fall. But I actually got my license at summer camp, and what I asked my parents for is what every kid asks his parents for. Can I have some money to buy some things? And they saw it was educational. I ended up with an ICO transmitter, and I built my own modulator. And I was just a kid then. I liked building stuff.
I see. And what was the receiver that you used with the ICO transmitter?
I started out with I think it was a Hammerland HQ170. Maybe I had one before that. I'm not exactly certain, but the 170 was a pretty nice radio.
Were you a shortwave listener before you went to summer camp?
I would listen to Radio Moscow, and long before that, and I wouldn't call it shortwave. My parents actually got me a crystal radio, which didn't work all that well in New York City because everything's metal framed, but I could listen to the Lone Ranger.
And what year did you get your first license from summer camp, and how old were you?
I was 13, and it was almost precisely 60 years ago. I've been a ham for 60 years, give or take a month or two.
So 1960, 1959?
50, it would have had to have been 59, sure.
Were you influenced at all by Sputnik and the race to space?
I was very much influenced by Sputnik, but not in a ham radio sort of way, because I had been reading science fiction actually before then, and I knew all about is hardly a way to put it, but I knew about satellites, I knew about geosynchronous orbits, and I remember very, very well, I think Sputnik was during the International Geophysical Year in '57, and I remember seeing on TV or reading a news bulletin or whatever it was that the Russians had launched this satellite, and my very first reaction is, it's about time. Literally, those words popped into my mind.
Because you were influenced by Arthur Clarke, who had already thought up the communication satellite.
Arthur Clarke was one of them. Heinlein, of course, was another. I shouldn't say of course, because all these guys are long gone. But, I was very much influenced by science fiction.
And you were able to grok most of what was happening in those days.
I think that word is a little bit gone, too. But, of course, I was, sure. I was a science dude.
Did ham radio play a part in the choices that you made for your education and career?
Education, probably not, unless you consider going to engineering school for a while, influenced by ham radio. But I probably would have done that whether I was a ham or not, because I was into broadcasting and building gadgetry. And career, pretty much emphatically so, because everybody involved with my career in radio and manufacturing and whatever were hams.
Why did you go into broadcasting? Did you have an interest in commercial broadcasting because of being a listener, or how did that evolve? Well,
I went to college, and I found that the school had a non-commercial radio station, which I immediately joined and spent far too much time doing stuff at the radio station. And I had gotten my FCC license, the commercial license, first-class FCC license, I think in high school, because I was near an examining station, so why not? And I applied for a job at the biggest and best commercial station on earth, which at the time was WABC in New York. And incredibly, they hired me as a vacation relief engineer after my first year of college.
Okay, and WABC was both a television and radio station?
Well, it was the flagship of the ABC network. The radio station, the local commercial radio station, played rock and roll, which I loved and still do. And the television station, my theory has long been, if God wanted pictures to fly through the air, he'd have given them tickets.
So you started as a vacation relief engineer. How long were you at WABC? And where did you go from there?
I was at ABC for, I think, a couple of summers. Then they hired me permanently, and I managed to keep going to school and work a full-time job until I tragically graduated. Most of your listeners won't be remembering this, but once you graduated from college in those days, you were subject to the draft. And it was never my goal to get shot at in a rice paddy in South Vietnam. So what I ended up doing was getting a job in a defense plant, and spent a couple of years playing around with those newfangled integrated circuits and designing gear for, for example, the Pueblo, if anyone remembers that incident, the spy ship, the American spy ship that the North Koreans captured.
Right, that was a whole incident.
Yeah.
And so how was that related to what you were you building receivers for ships like the Pueblo?
Yeah, and not so much receivers, but spectrum analyzers, which has been a long-time interest of mine. In fact, if you look at my blog, you'll find one labeled Beauty Contest. And you know how people collect cars or seashells or arts or even QSL cards. I used to collect spectrum analyzers.
Really?
You can see a grid of them on there. and we were building what they called at the time real-time spectrum analyzers. Now it's pretty trivial to do it with the fast Fourier transform and other software, but back then it was quite a challenge. And we made these products and sold them to the various government agencies.
And what company were you working for?
It was Federal Scientific at the time. It was long since bought out and bought out again and bought out again and now defunct. But the laws relating to the draft at the time were that until you were 26 years old, they could take you away. And so I stayed there until I was 26. And then sort of intertwined with my last few months there, founded another company at which, incredibly, I still work, and which even more incredibly continues to exist, which is called Eventide.
So let's talk about Eventide. How did you come to found Eventide? Maybe a little bit of background on Eventide. What does Eventide do? What do they produce? What do you produce? It seems like it's a miracle that it's still in business today.
It sure does, doesn't it?
Well, when most businesses don't seem to last 10 years.
Yeah, our 50th anniversary is coming up.
That's amazing.
A year and a bit. It is. I remain stunned. My mom, if she were still around, would be very happy because at one point she said, "You're going to quit your job? Oh, my God, what's going to happen to you?" And I said, "Mom, I'm in my 20s. I'll be okay. I can get another job if this doesn't work." But no, it did. It did. Anyway, what happened was I had, and this is where ham radio comes in, a couple of buddies who were hams who were involved in building a recording studio and said, "Richard, can you give us a hand?" Because I was a bit more of a technical guy and they were a bit more of the recording studio guys, let's say. And so I started designing equipment for these this recording venture. And then one of them said, "Can you make me a tape locator? Because I've got a very small studio. I don't have room for an assistant. The machine is big. I want to be able to rewind and go to a particular place on the tape without wasting time." And I said, "No, yeah, I can do that," because we had integrated circuits then with counters and dividers and Nixie tubes. So I built this gadget, and he turned around and sold it to Ampex, yet another company that's currently defunct, but has great historical significance in the recording business because they made all the VTRs and the multi-track audio recorders back in the day. And so I built this thing. He sold it, and suddenly we're in business. So we needed a name. We actually started out as Eventide Clockworks until we dropped the Clockworks with a big spring, and we're still around.
I'll put a link in the show notes page to Eventide. What other problems have you been solving in the recording business for the last 50 years?
Well, like a lot of new companies, we solve problems that nobody knows exist. When you sing a song, for example, you sing a song. And if you want to make it sound better on a tape, it's always good to have someone singing along, or talking along if they can, singing along with you. So we made a thing called a delay line, which could make your own voice get a little later and maybe lower the volume, and it sounds like you're a chorus. We made later on pitch changers, things called flangers, which are a special effect. Dynamic effects, which are like compressors that you use in ham radio, but a little bit more sophisticated. And we branched off there in later years to making computer products and products for aviation and products for 9/11 stentors, and we're still doing some of that.
And now this message from ICOM America. Heard it, worked it, logged it. It's time to get the transceiver that's best suited for your lifestyle. ICOM offers a variety of high-performance and innovative products for the occasional operator, rag chewer, DXer, or contester. Make the most out of contest season with one of these ICOM transceivers today. The ICOM IC7610 is the SDR every ham wants. This high-performance transceiver has the ability to pick out the faintest of signals even in the presence of stronger adjacent signals. The ICOM IC7610 is a direct sampling software-defined radio, or SDR, that will change the world's definition of an SDR transceiver. The ICOM IC7610 features include RF direct sampling system, 110 dB RMDR, independent dual receivers, and dual digicell. The ICOM IC7300 changes the way that entry-level HF transceivers are designed. This high-performance, innovative HF transceiver with a compact design will far exceed your expectations. I purchased the IC7300 last fall and have fallen in love with its waterfall display, allowing me to zero in on activity and potential QSOs on the air. The ICOM IC7300 features include RF direct sampling, 15 discrete bandpass filters, large 4.3-inch color touchscreen, real-time spectrum scope with waterfall display, and an SD memory card slot. The ICOM IC7851 is the Primo Contester's HF transceiver. Keep your competitive contesting edge with faster processors, higher input gain, higher display resolution, and a cleaner signal. The ICOM's IC7851 is the pinnacle of HF perfection. The ICOM IC7851's features include dual receivers to allow you to listen and to pounce on contest contacts, digital IF filters, memory keyer, digital voice recorder, high-resolution spectrum waterfall display, enhanced PC connectivity, and an SD memory card slot. So be ready for the upcoming contests this season with the new ICOM transceiver. ICOM has rigs for every level of operator, and they are available at the ham radio store near you. Go to www.icomamerica.com/amateur for more information on these fine ICOM transceivers. And when you make that ICOM purchase, be sure to tell your dealer that you heard about it here on QSO Today. And now back to our QSO. Let's talk a little bit about ham radio. You're now in Sedona, Arizona. What do you operate in Sedona, Arizona, and what is it about ham radio that really floats your boat?
Well, I'll take that as two questions.
It is two questions.
Because the Sedona part is a little bit interesting, because I moved from New Jersey to Sedona, and in New Jersey I was lucky enough to have a couple of nice towers and some big antennas. And when we moved to Sedona, which is a big tourist area and has plenty of scenery, the very first thing, literally before even thinking about moving there, which is, it's just such a lovely place, but they have rules. Everybody has rules, and we were concerned about being able to put up an antenna. So I went to City Hall. I found out the rules and regulations, which basically state if you are a ham, and only if you are a ham, you can have a 60-foot tower. And so I took a photograph of that just to make sure they didn't change it on me. We bought a house and put up a tower. Well, like a lot of other hams and a lot of other localities, people aren't happy with the tower in their view. And we had a small handful of neighbors, most of whom were fine with it, but two were getting a little cranky, and we had the usual argument. The mayor came to visit me, sat in the living room for an hour. He had a background in business radio, and said, Mr. Factor, or maybe Richard, I forget what he called me. He said, how about if you take down that tower with the 4-element stepper beam and put up a dipole? He suggested. And I suggested, no, I don't think I could do that. And then he said, well, how much did you spend putting this up? And I told him, and he pretty much understood that I wasn't going to take it down and put up a dipole, and the neighbors are whining and whatever. But all of that has calmed down. One neighbor left, the other one everybody hates, and we're good now.
Are there other hams in the neighborhood?
There are quite a few hams in Sedona, a few of whom I know, including one of whom I met on just walking on a trail. He said, oh, I'm a ham radio operator. I said, well, guess what? I dragged him over to see the tower base, which had just been poured. But there are very few active DXers in Sedona, so far as I know.
So what kind of rig do you have on that 60-foot tower?
I have as I said, the 4-element stepper, I just got a TS990. I looked at that a few years ago at a broadcast show which I was attending, and I said, my God, this thing does everything all by itself. I don't need accessories. I don't need anything. I just connect it to an antenna, and I've got it all. And so TS990 it is, Kenwood.
I see. And because you're a DXer, you don't operate 40, 80, 160? I
operate 40 on occasion. I don't really have room for a decent 80-meter antenna, but as you might expect, until these recent days of almost no propagation, I can work a lot on 20 through 10, and the stepper will tune to anything. So it's one antenna is enough, really.
What's your favorite operating mode?
Mostly CW, some sideband. I'm not much of a rag chewer. I know you couldn't tell from a podcast, but I really don't talk very much on the air. And CW, I like to operate in contests, although not seriously to win anything. I'll go on for an hour here, an hour there. And, of course, you could see me in the pile-ups, as they say.
Do you operate the digital modes at all?
I actually am not fond of digital modes, despite building my entire career off digital audio and digital electronics and computers. And to go back again to my youth, I remember pretending to be sick one day so I could build an analog RTTY demodulator for my Model 26 teletype machine that I bought surplus. Because back then it was really fun to operate, but now I don't know. I'm ambivalent about it. I haven't really done much digital operating since it got to be too easy.
Do you get in the zone when you operate CW and you're chasing DX?
I guess so. I noticed that my CW copying skill improves immensely after I've been on for just a couple of minutes in a contest. I can copy at whatever speed I need to, and try not to make mistakes and what have you. So I guess in a sense it focuses one's concentration enough that the rest of the world disappears, at least briefly. So I think the answer to that is yes.
You say on your QRZ page that you still need the DX entity P5, which is North Korea, and that is now a race between your existence and the country's existence if you achieve it. How important are DX entities to DXers, and how important is P5 to you?
Well, taking that in reverse order, since I would be at the top of the honor roll if I managed to work North Korea, and I'd actually splurge for a plaque to put up, and seeing as how I've been doing this almost literally all my life, or literally almost all my life would be a better way to put it, it's pretty important, and I told my wife that if I ever hear that there's really going to be a de-expedition to P5, I would fly from New York back to Sedona just to get on the air and work them. So important, yes. Critical to my continued existence, well, I really don't have much control over that. So,
do you think that if there was some détente with North Korea that perhaps you would actually go to P5 to operate from there?
Well, no, I don't think I would, because then I wouldn't be able to work it, would I?
No, that's absolutely true. Unless you had a remote station, right, and you could work it from...
I suppose it would be possible, but I didn't answer the other half of your question, which is how important are entities to DX stations and... or DX operators, I should say, and the answer is you get yourself a bell curve, and you can put people along that, and some people couldn't care less and work them at random, and some people are totally fanatic and are plotting right now to create the détente just so they can activate P5. But it's pretty important to me because it's one of the few lifetime accomplishments that I haven't quite accomplished and could do so easily if they weren't such bozos over there.
It's my understanding, and I'm not a DXer, and I don't know a lot about DXing other than the conversations that I've had on the QSO Today podcast, but it seems to me that you can chase DX entities band by band, right? So you could have, I'm assuming that you could work 5 bands or 7 bands and try to get entities in all of the bands, or you can be satisfied just by working all of the entities in whatever bands happen to work. How do you work it?
Well, first of all, I would say the ARRL is doing everything they possibly can to encourage people to work a lot of DX on a lot of bands. And I sort of play along with that. I don't have 5-band DXCC because I really don't operate 80 meters. But getting DXCC on 1 band or on 5 bands, especially nowadays, isn't much of a challenge. And, of course, one of their goals is to encourage amateur radio, and that's one way to do it. I'm kind of casual about it. I wouldn't fly across the country, for example, to work some country that I had on 20 that I don't have on 15, and I don't think many other people would. But again, you've got the bell curve. You've got some people who spend their entire life on the air trying to get every country on every band, and most people like myself will do it casually, but not fanatically.
Now, do you have a rig there in New York?
I actually do have a rig at work, but I try not to use it very much because we do a lot of very delicate electronic stuff in the building, and I don't want to bring everyone's research into a
standstill as a result of that ham in the building.
It would be worse than a standstill.
On your website, you have a relational puzzle with 3 answers. I got it right, perhaps for the wrong reasons. Can you talk about the pre-UPS, what it is and where it should go?
Yeah, I pronounce it pre-ups.
Pre-ups.
And it came to me, I had purchased a Prius, Toyota Prius automobile, and I'm thinking to myself, I got it for the usual reasons. You get really good gas mileage, and I was commuting at the time. I was driving quite a bit. And I said, well, this will save me money, plus it's good for the environment, plus I love electricity. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that the Prius is really a generator. It's not just a car, and it's sitting idle in the driveway most of the day or in the garage. How about if I turn it into an emergency power source? And thinking of emergency power, well, that would be a UPS, wouldn't it? And PRIUS is so close that the name popped into my alleged mind. So I took the car apart. I connected stuff to the high voltage battery. I bought some nice big UPSs on eBay, and actually put together a system where if there was a power failure, the car would power the house. And it really worked out pretty well, surprisingly so.
I somehow recall reading an article. Was it in QST? Did you write about this in QST?
I didn't write about it myself, but the guy who does the eclectic technology column devoted one column to that concept. And they've also put it in some radio broadcasting magazines because, of course, broadcasters always need emergency power. And I touted it there. I think maybe I did write that article. I don't remember.
What did you conclude from that? I'm curious. Should hams be converting? Should they use your conversion kit to convert their Toyota Prius into a UPS?
Well, I would certainly recommend it. I should emphasize that I do not have or sell or make a conversion kit. It is not a commercial enterprise at all. But there's a lot of information on my website that explains how to do it. And as we advance towards more and more electric cars, I think it's almost a tragedy that the manufacturers who have these enormous batteries in their car, either the hybrids or the plug-in hybrids or what have you, even the pure electric cars, don't make a provision for what they call vehicle-to-grid, where you can take power out of the car as well. So yes, I recommend it. I recommend it for almost everyone who doesn't live in a big apartment building. If you live in a single or dual family dwelling, it's just a wonderful project, and it could conceivably save your life. I mean, all sorts of things go wrong with electricity, and you don't want it to happen to you. Especially on the East Coast, where the weather can be foul, I would think. Yeah. It wouldn't be terribly useful in New York, of course, because everybody lives in a big apartment building and you can't drive up to your apartment. Right. But most other places you can, and it's a wonderful concept that hasn't fully caught on. It's partially caught on, just not enough.
Did you have some automation to actually start the engine and refresh the battery before the battery gets down so it won't get you out of the garage? Actually,
the way I implemented it, which was involving a really big computer room UPS, the process I followed was, first of all, I got some actual electricians with licenses to come and separate the important things like the refrigerator, because I don't want my ice cream to melt, and my computer, and a few other things you need to keep the house running, and separate that from the big loads that really you can get away without, like a pool pump or air conditioning for the time being. So I got all that stuff separated, and then the UPS that I purchased on eBay was enough to power everything temporarily. So what would happen is, if there was a power glitch, and I have all sorts of examples of this on my blog, where I actually somebody knocked over a power pole a few doors down from my house, and I covered the day in photographs and voltage graphs. Everything worked automatically without any automation, because that's what UPSs do. If your power cuts out, the UPS takes over. So I'd look at the voltage, I'd look at the computer, and I'd say, this power outage is going to be more than 10 seconds or more than a minute. And I'd just go downstairs and start up the car, and then the car would take care of all of it all by itself.
Well, that's pretty cool. So you'd start the car to refresh the UPS. So the UPS just rode you through the outage.
Yeah, you start the car, and the battery stays charged.
What the UPS does is it prevents the power from ever going down in the house on the loads in the house, right? So it smooths over the power outage, but you don't have a long time on the UPS. So then you connect the Prius, and the Prius then recharges the UPS.
Yeah, that's almost precisely correct. And the engine in the Prius, because this was an older Prius that only had a modest battery capability, you turn on the engine, and then it keeps the battery in the Prius charged, which keeps the battery in the UPS charged.
I've never been in a Prius, actually, so for all of my listeners, I apologize for, because I think Prius is probably pretty popular. When you say turning it on, it doesn't mean that the engine is running. It means that the engine will start if the battery gets to a certain level?
That's correct. And, in fact, to expand on it just a little bit, when I moved to Sedona, Arizona is like one of the best places in the United States for solar power, so I put in solar power. And then I use the solar power to charge the battery in my new Prius, which is a plug-in Prius. So, although I don't actually have my pre-ups project in Sedona, because I got the Tesla Powerwall batteries there, but all of this can work on solar, and of course the car, if it's a plug-in hybrid, Prius or other brand, you just have to keep the gas tank filled. That'll provide power for days at least.
So if there's any entrepreneurs out there, that looks like there could be an opportunity for conversion kits for the Toyota Prius.
A few people worked on that, but I think they either felt it was too complicated or too expensive. You do need to have some technical skills to do it if the car manufacturer doesn't cooperate with you, which they don't seem to be doing yet. So it tried to catch on a little bit, and now it's 15 years later, 15 years after I started the project, and you still don't have houses that are powered from cars. But I think it's a coming thing eventually.
Well, I think it's a state of mind, don't you think? I think people just don't think that way. They think of the house powering the car, but not vice versa.
I'm sure that's mostly true, yeah.
You write a blog called Rickle Blog, and you could probably say why it's called Rickle Blog. That seems to move you from time to time. Why do you blog, and why is amateur radio not the center of your blog?
First let me explain the name. My name being Richard, or as I used to call myself in my earlier days, Rick or Ricky, you've got the R-I-C-K there, and then my call letters, quite accidentally, are WA2IKL, so you take the Rick and the IKL, and you come up with Rickle. And that's what people used to call me. So actually at least when they knew I was a ham. So back in the day, I had that name, and the blog is named after that just because I had to name it something, I guess. Why it isn't centered around ham radio, well, I guess I would have to explain that by not being a full-time ham. I've got a lot of other stuff I'm interested in, things I read about, things I write about, and it is about ham radio. I know I did one on North Korea, one on the Andaman Islands, and ham radio does get mentioned from time to time. It isn't centered on that, I guess, because maybe I'm not interested in developing a following. That could be it. I never really thought too hard about it, but because it's about so many different things, nobody really goes to it to look at anything. So I joke that I have thousands of millireaders, and of course, 1,000 millireaders equals one actual person, just like 1,000 millihelens is the amount of beauty it takes to launch one ship.
Now that's really funny. We're speaking of Helen of Troy, of course, right? Who launched 1,000 ships, yeah.
Hey, this is Eric for just another short break. One of my favorite ham radio podcasts is the Ham Radio Workbench podcast, hosted by George, KJ6VU, my guest in episode 232, and Jeremy, KF7IJZ. George and Jeremy take a bi-weekly deep dive into their favorite ham radio workbench projects and the technologies that fascinate them. If you want to be a ham radio builder or just be inspired, click on the link in this week's show notes page.
And now back to our QSO today. What I liked about the blog was that you observe things that perhaps we all observe, but we don't really notice it. You seem to notice a lot of things, and that's why I think your blog is interesting reading. And maybe you have more than millireaders. Maybe you have actually a number of readers. It's actually quite interesting. Can I ask you, there's illustrations and pictures on your website that I sense that science fiction literature was something that is important to you or was important to you, and did it have an influence on the way that you look at the world?
How could I answer that more strongly than OMG, yes, yes, yes? I would say that science fiction influenced me as much as ham radio influenced my career and what I do for a living. I remember my mom reading Tom Corbett's Space Cadet to me before I could read myself, which is not a terribly sophisticated version of science fiction. And then, of course, there was Tom Swift in the unlamented Rick Brant series. But one day, I discovered Heinlein, Robert A. Heinlein, on my own. And he wrote a book that involved alternate spectra, like electrogravitic spectra, and things that actually kind of exist in relativity, even if we don't use them in any meaningful way at this point. And I was just fascinated by the science and by the possibilities. I could say one of my big disappointments is that signing up for the moon voyage when I was a kid and Pan Am was still in business never eventuated. We still don't have any spacecraft propulsion worthy of the name, and there's a lot of disappointments. And science fiction has migrated a bit to more sociological and maybe darker and more fantastic elements. But I'm a child of the 50s with the golden age of science fiction with Asimov and Clarke and Heinlein and space travel and galactic wars and all that, which are now, I guess, the subject of media without very much real exploration of the science. So to answer your question, did I say yes? I think I meant yes.
A big Y-E-S.
I would capitalize all three letters and put an exclamation point there as well.
Would you point your kids back to those authors if you wanted them to have an appreciation for the world? Do you look at the world still with science fiction eyes? Is it still wonderful? Do you still wonder?
Let me first make clear that I don't have any kids to point to it, and our dog, who is the cutest puppy in the world, by the way, and he even appears on my website, doesn't read. A tragedy, because he's got these wonderful big floppy ears. But I'd be a little bit careful about that, because I want my kids to be a little bit more politically correct than I am or was. And some of those books, of course, have attitudes of the 50s as well as a fantastical science of the 50s. And the last thing I want to do is have my notional kids writing in Europe, because they've been expelled from the country for their old-fashioned ideas. But in terms of just wonder, I absolutely would do that if I could censor some of Heinlein's not necessarily wrong, but definitely unpolitically correct theories, for example. And Asimov, yes, I would. I think Asimov, I'd get away with just saying, yeah, sure, go ahead and read that.
It's funny because I also am a science fiction reader and I still look at all the things we do. Even ham radio, I pinch myself and say, you know what, I know how it works, and it still amazes me. And yet my children don't think that there's anything to it. For me, it just seems so magical, and for the younger generations, perhaps, it just seems so normal.
Yes, with a couple of capitals in that one. Of course, you're right, and of course, we're all products of our upbringing. For example, in my lifetime, there weren't any horses on the streets of New York except for tourists, and automobiles didn't seem terribly magical, but jet planes came in when I was a kid, and I still just marvel at the fact that I can get in an airplane and be on the other side of the country and be home in one day, in less than a day. And I look around me and see that people have the window shades down. You know, I can't fathom flying in an airplane without looking out.
I can fly from Israel to San Francisco nonstop. If I leave at midnight Israel time, I arrive at 4 in the morning the same day, California time. And I think it's just an amazing experience. And then I'm always sitting next to the guy that doesn't like the food. And I'm thinking, I said,
that would be me.
This is a miracle, you know. This is a miracle. We're shuttling through space at 600 miles an hour in an aluminum tube. And you're complaining about the food. And I'm just going, this is just a different time.
Well, A, you're absolutely right, and B, the food does really taste terrible.
It is, yes.
Partly a product of the altitude, by the way. They've done some research on that and say you need more salt, and of course that encourages you to drink more, which is very inconvenient, so I guess they don't put the salt in.
You mentioned Zeugma on your blog, and I'm just wondering, I've never heard the word before. Well, what is Zeugma, and how do you use it?
It's just a word that came up because a friend of mine was talking about a song that somebody had, which was it had the lyrics "in high spirits and a Cadillac," and she said to me, "Oh, that's a Zeugma." And as you pointed out, I like to observe things, and occasionally I'll read a Zeugma or occasionally write a Zeugma. And I just love the word, Zeugma. It's a standard dictionary word. It falls into things like various forms of rhetoric, synecdoche, litotes, and metaphor, and whatever. It's just one of that group of words. But I just like saying Zeugma.
On your blog, you mentioned that every day you have a chemical of the day. What's your chemical of the day today?
That's not entirely correct. What my chemical of the day is whenever I read the newspaper. I typically read the Wall Street Journal, and they're always writing articles about insecticides or things that'll cause the world to melt. And whenever I see a genuine chemical name, I say, that's a new one, and I put it in my blog. There's absolutely no reason for it. There's certainly no purpose to it any more than my periodic table bingo, which both appear in the same annex to the blog. But the chemical of the day could be anything from sodium chloride to, and I was about to give something away there. I better not use that one.
Well, you wrote a whole article on Roundup. It's very convenient if you don't care about the environment.
Well, the interesting thing about that Roundup, which the active ingredient is glyphosate, and I guess I'm paraphrasing my blog here, is that there is an enormous amount of disagreement as to whether the active principle in the product, which is an insecticide used by farmers all over the world, is or isn't carcinogenic. And obviously, I'm not doing that research, but the UN says it may be. The U.S. government says, no, we don't think it is. And when you've got scientific disagreement like that, of course, you can find an expert on either side. So they sued Bayer, which purchased Monsanto, which is the one that came up with this stuff, in court. And if you follow the American courts, you know that sometimes you get a verdict that, let's say, isn't entirely representative of reality. And so people who are exposed to this stuff, obviously some people who are exposed to it and some people who aren't exposed to it got cancer. And there's no real way of knowing whether this chemical caused this particular person's cancer. As I say, the United States government says, no, it's not carcinogenic, but people get cancer all the time. And maybe, because I certainly am in no position to take a stand on whether it did or didn't. So they sued, and they won a jury verdict. I think if I remember correctly, it was $1.7 billion. And that was really the part that I was commenting on, not so much the carcinogenicity of glyphosate. $1.7 billion. Now, if everybody who ever had cancer won that, imagine what the world would be like.
That's amazing.
Isn't it?
It is amazing, yeah. What was the chemical that they used for killing mosquitoes?
DDT.
DDT, but it wasn't diazinon, it was...
This is Eric during the edit. I'm just adding that what the chemical was malathion. Malathion was what was used, I think, to spray for mosquitoes in those days.
I remember in Southern California growing up, they say, stay in your house tonight because we're flying over the city with helicopters killing mosquitoes.
Yes, I don't remember that specific incident.
This is in the 60s, I think.
I do remember things like it, but there's a very well-known and very accurate saying in chemistry and medicine, which is the dose makes the poison. And it's literally true that any chemical, even water, will kill you. You can drown in water, or somebody can drop a big boulder of salt on your head. It'll kill you. And you certainly don't want to breathe insecticides, whether or not they're carcinogenic, in big quantities. So if they're spraying right over you, you do want to keep away from that, even if it's not terribly dangerous, eating the residue or what have you. You certainly don't want to breathe it in concentration of parts per thousand. So that could very well be why, but they did find other problems with DDT. There it is, 11222-trichloroethane, 1-diol-bis-4-chlorobenzene, which is the IUPAC ID.
Interesting.
Good to know, isn't it?
Yes, it is, actually.
I'm sure you know the things like nerve gas are just insecticides for people. They work over the same pathways in many cases. It just has to match the chemistry of the organism you're trying to kill.
And now this message from QRP Labs. QRP Labs has shipped thousands of QCX QRP transceivers kits to date. The odds of working another QCX user gets better every day. If you're looking for a satisfying kit experience where you end up with an amazing performing QRP transceiver for under $50, let me say that again, for under $50, then you owe it to yourself to go to QRP Labs. We have many home brewers who listen to the QSO Today podcast. For you, QRP Labs also has parts, filters, enclosures, and other handy devices to make your home brewing experience even better. You can use these parts to either enhance your QRP Labs kits or to beef up your own homebrew designs. Be sure to browse Hand's entire website. Use the link on this week's show notes page or the one in the sponsored section of the QSO Today website to get to QRP Labs to buy your QCX or any of the other fine QRP Labs kits or parts. QRP Labs is my go-to ham radio kit company. It should be yours too. QRP Labs. And now back to our QSO Today. So you have an affinity for chemistry and physics as well as electronics?
I like science, yeah.
You're a baby boomer. I think I'm at the end of the baby boom generation. You're at the beginning, I think, of the baby boom generation. Are you a product of your generation? And what do you think your generation's legacy is to this generation?
Well, certainly a lot of debt. I mean, everybody complains how much we've run up the debt that our children, or our hypothetical children in my case, will have to pay. I think we've also provided world-class transportation and much better computers and much better radios, just from my own point of view. Am I a product of my generation? Inevitably so. I grew up, my 20s, I spent listening to psychedelic music, and I still like it. That's a pretty open-ended question, although I've got a lot of psychedelic music on my computer.
Well, I've never asked this question on the QSO Today podcast, but in reading your blog posts, I kind of thought that you'd actually thought about this.
I try not to do too much wool gathering. The other day, I actually had a notion, because I'm getting old, or, well, let me rephrase that. I'm old, and I kind of enjoy it. I think about ageism, and really it doesn't terribly interest me. I think you just have to have a sense of humor about everything, or you'll make yourself unhappy, and I'm not keen on doing that. And I thought that it would be fun to start another blog, which I haven't done yet, but I picked up the URL, and it's askafossil.com. I don't even think I have it under construction, but that's my domain. And one of these days, I'm going to impart my wisdom to my thousands or even tens of thousands of millireaders. Thank you for being 1,000 of them. I've learned a lot of stuff, and as Mark Twain would put it, stuff that is so and a lot of stuff that ain't so. It's quite the journey.
One last question on the blog. Do you write the blog as a way to clarify things for you? Do you write for self-clarification?
No. I generally think about something and I say, boy, isn't that interesting? Or I find a quote in a newspaper like the radioactive money in Kazakhstan or whatever. And I tend to have a little bit of a wry sense of humor, as you probably discovered. And so I just start scribbling, and then at some point I say, wait a minute, I'm out of time, or wait a minute, I'm out of words, and say, okay, that's about enough, and I write it. I don't think I ever get any revelations to myself from it, but I do sometimes come up with, well, I was going to use the word clever, but that would be self-aggrandizing. Let's call it silly. Some silly thoughts, and I like putting them on paper because they don't last in my head long enough.
You have a link to SETI on your website. SETI is the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. Do you have an interest in SETI, and do you run their screensaver on your computer?
In reverse order, I did run the screensaver on all the computers at work. I just walked around into everybody's office when they went home for the day and put them on. But that got tiring pretty fast, both in the computers and because there are no real results. So I got something like 100,000 work units and stopped doing it. I don't even know if they're still doing that project. But yes, that's part of it. But my real contribution, if you could call it that, to the search is back in the 90s, I think it was 93 or 94, the Congress said, we're going to discontinue spending money on the superconducting super collider, which I thought was a tragedy, and stop spending money on SETI because one particular senator thought it was a waste of time or money or wanted publicity, whatever it is that senators do. And thinking of the two, I realized there were about 4 decimal orders of magnitude between the costs. The superconductor super collider, I'm not going to Texas and digging a tunnel with my bare hands, but I could actually do something about SETI because it's a very low-cost, low-risk, high-reward enterprise if it should happen to discover anything. And so I started an organization called the SETI League, which was actually a public charity, membership-supported organization where I was trying to get people, including, to a large extent, amateur radio operators, interested interested in looking for extraterrestrial signals. And my buddy Paul N6TX, to this day, is our executive director of the organization, although he's gone emeritus. And unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, we've been just as successful as NASA and all the other organizations in that we haven't found anything, and neither have they. But we're all hopeful, I should say.
What kind of impact has amateur radio had on your family life?
I could start by saying what family life.
Well, you have a wife. Usually it begins and ends with the XYL is what I've discovered. I
married very late in life, and she exhibits remarkable tolerance, including defending my tower, which is right outside the house, against the neighbors. So I love her for that, among other things. But really, I would say that ham radio per se is not a large enough part of my life. What really affected it is the fact that during the years between founding the company back in call it 1970 and the year 2000, when we started getting some real people who know about management. And I would be working so many hours a day that even sunlight was a rare treat. So I didn't really have time or interest in a family life, and I would say that's what affected it.
What do you think the greatest challenge is facing amateur radio now?
Relevance. I doubt that I'm the first person who suggested that the Internet is really subsuming a lot of the instinct for people to want to communicate with each other. In fact, one of the blogs that I was working on will probably end up publishing before this podcast gets on the Internet, is the suggestion that ham radio is just like a really, really terrible Internet, where instead of being able to send an email, you've both got to be on at the same time. You've got to have a big infrastructure of your own, as opposed to just connecting to a cable, etc. So that's the issue, I think, facing ham radio. I'm sure young people and old people want to communicate, but it's just too easy now.
But if we drove back to the 70s or even the 60s leading up to the establishment of Eventide, your business, it seems to me that amateur radio produced a level of expertise and thinking and exploration that I don't necessarily see from a technical standpoint these days amongst the majority of young people. With all due respect to the young people that may be listening, they're listening and that makes them different. But we don't even have a generation now of people that can fix anything. And I'm just wondering, don't you think amateur radio in all of its forms right now has that ability to create that level of expertise that you may be looking for in another couple of years?
Another quick answer, yes. I'd say you're absolutely right, but then I have to give the young people of today a big excuse. Go back to my youth. I was always very lucky with my eyesight. Even after playing with carbon arcs with my train transformer, I could still see pretty well, and I took a Coast Guard exam once for a merchant marine, and I found that my vision, much to my surprise, was 20/15, better than 20/20. Well, nowadays, if I were a young person wanting to build something or fix something, I would need a microscope to be able to find the electronic components that we could hold in our hand. So other than the makers, which is a new phenomenon that I've been reading about, where you have 3D printing and maker fairs and what have you, it's really difficult. I've got a cell phone that's right next door to me here, and I wouldn't dream of trying to fix it. If anything goes wrong, you either get a new cell phone or maybe pray over it for a while and then take it to the repair station. It's just a totally different ball game, as we would say. I don't hold anything against young people for not being the way I was when I was young.
Fair enough. What excites you the most about what's happening in amateur radio now?
In total contradistinction to what I said earlier, in that I am not all that interested in doing the digital modes myself, I am thrilled that the communication technology, which allows communication with signal to noise ratios of -20 or -30 dB, and all the other things that allow reliable radio communication. And of course, this would play into SETI and intersolar system and interstellar communication. I think all of this stuff is just amazing at how much progress we've made with it, and I know amateurs are pretty much at the forefront of this. So good work, guys.
Well, it seems to me that software-defined radio now, and even the ability to listen at minus 30 dB, would actually perhaps breathe new life into SETI and programs like that.
Absolutely. It's the negative signal-to-noise ratios, which depend on cooperation between the sender and receiver. That's kind of difficult to achieve with aliens light years away. But you never know. You might be able to figure it out. One of the reasons for that screensaver is to look for signals that are, in fact, way below the noise level, and just spend a lot of computer processing time to try to find them. And some of my electronics buddies work on that kind of project right now. And it may not be amateur radio the way I practice it by going to a keyer or a microphone, but it's an advance, and I love it.
Richard, what advice would you give to new or returning hams to the hobby?
I guess I could be a little silly and say keep away from neighbors. That would be a start. I don't know that I have any really good advice, because as much as I love ham radio and people my age do, I recognize the attraction of the Internet, and I would say maybe start a company, start something entrepreneurial that involves communication. There's a lot of those already, but there could be more. I remember one of my blog items. I think it was the man with the telepath hat that kind of covers that. So I'm not prescriptive on this stuff. I think if you do something that you find interesting and challenging, whether it's ham radio or electronics or any sort of science, that would be my advice. Try to find something interesting to do. If you're really young, don't let your classwork interfere with your education, and try to enjoy this stuff.
Richard, I want to thank you so much for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. I really enjoyed, I think, more researching this episode before speaking with you, and so for me it was a real gas, and I really appreciate it. So thank you so much for joining me, 73.
Thank you, Eric, 4Z1UG. It's been my pleasure speaking with you, and maybe I'll see you on the air. Who knows?
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Richard. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in WA2IKL in the search box at the top of the page. My thanks to both ICOM America and QRP Labs for their support of the QSO Today podcast. Please show your support for these fine sponsors by clicking on their links in the show notes pages or by using QSO Today in the coupon box at the checkout. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any of the episodes into written text, please contact me. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing the subscribe buttons on the show notes pages. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor, monthly or annually, by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes page, or use my Amazon link before shopping at Amazon. Amazon gives me a small commission on your purchases while at the same time protecting your privacy. I'm grateful for any way that you show appreciation and support. It makes a big difference as I head towards episode 300. QSO Today is now available on iHeartRadio and a bunch of other online audio services, including the iTunes Store. Look on the right side of the show notes pages for a listing of these services. You can use Amazon Echo and say, "Alicia, play the QSO Today podcast from TuneIn." My thanks to my new friend and audio editor, Ben Bresky, for putting this show together from the pieces that I give him. Until next time, this is Eric 4Z1UG 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.